Hello everyone, my name is CENG591. I'm going to present the paper titled Motion Planning Among Dynamic Decision-Making Agents with Deep Reinforcement Learning in this video. So here is the outline. I will give a brief introduction, then follows a literature review, and I'm going to describe the framework and its relevance with previous and current works, then the algorithmic and architectural details of the current work, and finally the results section. So there are three main approaches on online motion planning as the authors listed. There is the static assumption on the agents, which I believe not applicable in replanning, at least, because if the agents are static and the agent is performing perfectly accurate motions, then there is no need to replan. Anyways, the second is the dynamic with constant velocity assumption, and this assumption is used in the previous work. I'm going to touch that later in more detail. And the third is the decision-making agents. I have bolded them because these are the used methods. So decision-making agents might have much more sophisticated dynamics, let's say, or policies than the constant velocity. That's why it is listed as a different item. So in the previous work, it is assumed to have known policies. Other agents are assumed to have known policies, whereas in the current work, they are assumed to have unknown policies. So the multi-agent collision avoidance literature has two main different class of methods, which are classical and learning-based. Classical methods can be also split into two, which are reaction-based and trajectory-based. And reaction-based methods are often short-sighted in time because they take a snapshot of the states of all of the robots. Since they have the perfect dynamics motion information about those robots, they forward propagate those states with the known dynamics for a fixed amount of time in the future, and ultimately they produce collision-free paths for all of the robots. This requires perfect and accurate communication, and it is not achievable in the real world. So they are mainly used for baseline as baseline algorithms. Whereas trajectory-based methods doesn't require such hard communication limitations, but at the very least they will require to have the accurate information of the robots at least at the stake of collision. So in that case, they require to merge the state space of all of the robots who are in the risk of collision, and for instance consider 5 robots which requires collision-free Cartesian paths, and in that case the state space becomes 15D, which is computationally not tractable for most of the geometrical solvers out there, at least in the reasonable time. Then there is the learning-based methods, which could be also split into two, and end training and the training on agent level state representations. End-to-end training, as applies in the most other domains, is taking the raw input data without any processing and selecting optimal actions out of these raw input. This is not really applicable on collision avoidance domain because there are many details and non-linear relations included in it. Therefore, also the authors defend the same hypothesis, and they embrace agent level state representation. As goes aligned with this, they define that state at first in the theoretical aspect. So in the theoretical aspect, the state of a robot consists of two main portions, observable and hidden portions. These hidden portions include goal of a robot and its preferred velocity, and consider other robots. Without any communication, we would not know any of it. That is why, in order to be able to train the model, they replace all of those hidden portions of the state with observable elements like position or velocity of another agent in the agent of our agent's local frame, and etc. After defining fully observable states, they set the policy equation, which actually maps a snapshot of a state or of a joint state to the optimal collision-free actions. which could be rephrased in more technical terms, a policy which minimizes expected time to goal with collision avoidance. So they first give a two-agent formulation of it as a minimization problem, such that, there are the constraints now listed. For example, the equation to list the collision avoidance constraint, such that the distance between two robots should be at least as the summation of their radiuses. 3 is the goal test, and 4 is the kinematic equation, kinematic constraint, and it is only used in the previous work, not in the current work. So there is the positive improvement update rule, and this update rule is again given only for theoretical purposes. It is not used in either previous or current work. In previous work, they use part of it, whereas for example, the first part of it is used, but the second part of it is not directly used, because these state transition dynamics are unknown due to lack of communication, and they assume a constant velocity dynamics for the time of delta t, and they apply some discrete evaluation of that velocities, and they compute the st+1 states, joint states. So after computing that, they also take the reward of that new joint state, or no, not the new, but the joint state we are in, the robots are in, and then they apply the arcmax operator to compute the optimal action. So this could be easily generalized to n agents. So the equation in 1 can be generalized into n agents by just combining all other agent vectors into 1. Also 2 and 4 must include pairwise collision constraints plus the kinematic constraints. That's all, and that's why they applied. Let's come to the semantic description of previous work. So in previous work, as I have frequently said, they assume known deterministic state transition dynamics for all of the other robots. They forward propagate the kinematics for delta t with the observed velocity v tilde. This delta t is very fragile hyperparameter, because if it is too small, then the DNN, which takes those states, could not differentiate between different states, and learning would just fail. If it is too much, it's too big, let's say, then the motions of the robots are missed in an intolerable manner. That's why they needed to tune that manually, and that is actually the main motive to produce the current work. So they apply value function approximation with a deep neural network which requires fixed size input. Therefore, it requires them to predefine the number of agents. And the action space is semi-continuous, meaning there are 25 pre-computed actions and 10 randomly sampled actions at each episode. But I believe that this is not the perfect method to choose, because randomly sampled actions they just make the learning slower, because it is about frequency of the states of the actions that are encountered in the past, and such a thing might stall the training at all. However, they have embraced such a method, and they have ended up with acceptable results. So I'm calling it semi-continuous because at last, in the end, there are 35 different actions, but this is a finite set of inputs because arcmax operator requires finite set of inputs, and there are only one loss function for the value function. Current work, on the other hand, removes known policy assumption by introducing or replacing the value function approximation with an actor critic method, A3C, to approximate both value and policy functions. Approximation of the policy function means that the P star SGNT is directly approximated rather than computing these long equations. Therefore, they got rid of any reliance on the state transition dynamics. They don't require it. They just need to behave on the data they receive or they produce. And they use G83C, which is a GPU accelerated version of A3C. It is an implementation detail. And as I said, action space is discretized and now much smaller. There are only 11 actions, and it's enough actually. And as the last novelty, they introduces this long short-term memory, a recurrent neural network to support arbitrary number of agents. So I will come to that section later on in the architecture, but yeah, it's an important detail actually. Then the output of LSTM is fed into the DNN by making some pre-processing in between. So here is the architecture. LSTM takes all of the other agent state vectors, but in the decreasing distance order, because as it is closer to the output, it is adding more weight, it is adding more influence in the outcome. That is why this is a natural ordering. Agen is the output of LSTM, and as you can see in the figure below, Agen and the state vector of the agent itself is combined to produce the golden vector SE, which is then fed into the DNN. Actually, this is a really good architecture, I believe, because they are effectively removing the the requirement to have a predefined number of agents. At the end, another difference is having these policy neurons, which actually corresponds to the approximation of the policy function as well. So here is the algorithm. I have taken this from the previous work because in the current work they didn't provide at least any pseudocode, but they have some textual descriptions of the algorithm or the change. So I have tried my best to adjust them. So let's see them. So any of the filtering, propagation, or some argmax, I mean policy improvement equations are removed. So what it does, this collision avoidance with deep RL algorithm does is simple. It samples actions and approximates the policy by feeding those actions as the inputs. So let's see the algorithm too. So it is GA3C. Trajectory training set is now taken from CADRL from the previous work. In previous work it was taken from a classical method. So output is now the policy. Yeah, the output is now the policy. So training is done on top of the policy, and there are some details of it, but it is just replacement of those joint vectors with the golden vector, which actually manifests the inclusion of the LSTM. After having the architecture illustrated, let's see some visual results. Actually, this visual results doesn't tell much. They just tell that the new approach just works as good as the old approach. Plus, in the next section, you see that when the number of agents goes, they increase, the previous approach starts to behave very bad, whereas the new approach have scaled well over it, and even the 20 agent case, it just works out of the box, whereas the previous approach, which is socially aware collision avoidance with deep RL, is just resulting in many different collisions. Then comes some quantitative results. So this is the comparison of new method, which is GAT-RC blah 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 versus the socially aware GADRL. For the first set of experiments where the number of agents are low, not low but 4 or 5, up to 5, the socially aware and J3C versions are performing more or less the same. But when the number of agents increase more over 6, J3C takes the leadership. I mean, it is really outperforming the other variants, and it could be seen in the tables that the failure rate of the J3C CADRL is much lower with respect to its 4 robot version versus the old previous work version. So the metric used in these comparisons are the extra time to goal, average extra time to goal for all of the robots for all of the agents in the simulation, and it represents an objective measurement of the algorithms. And as a bonus from the previous work, there is the CADRL versus the ORCA. ORCA means optimal reciprocal collision avoidance, which is a classical method, which is a trajectory-based method. And you can see that, yeah, CADRL is much superior with respect to the ORCA. Yeah. So, thank you for listening.